Welcome to the Virginia Civics and Economics Lecture Series. At the end of each slide, there will be a 5-second delay. Use this time to complete your notes. When you are done, push play and move on to the next slide. This presentation will begin in 5 seconds. Welcome to Virginia Civics and Economics Lecture 4.1 on the structure and power of federal government, and it's time to go all the way back to Unit 1 and look at our federal government. You know, Article 1 Congress, Article 2 the Executive, and Article 3 the courts, and we need to remember all those checks and balances which make the United States government the most purposely inefficient government in the world. So, we know the limitations of government, but what really are the powers of the government? And does this look the same on the state level? Is Virginia government designed exactly the same as the federal government? And do both governments exist for the same reason? Today, we begin to answer these questions. And with that said, go to the next slide. Contrary to popular belief, it's not like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton made up our government out of thin air. Instead, they took what they liked from the British system of government and they made it our own. And while our government is limited, we have a very powerful government. The legislative, executive, and judicial powers of the national government are distributed among 3 distinct and independent branches of government. The legislative branch consists of the Congress, which is a bicameral or 2-house legislature consisting of the House of Representatives. There are 435 members, those are congressmen, assigned to each state based on population, and the Senate. There are 100 members, those are senators, with 2 members per state, no matter the state's population. Then we have the executive branch, which is headed by the President of the United States of America, who is the chief executive officer and commander-in-chief of the country. Last but not least is the judiciary, which consists of the federal courts, including the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land, and bankruptcy courts created by Congress pursuant to the Constitution. These are the 3 branches of government. Go to the next slide. President Ronald Reagan once said that government is the problem, and for those people who rally around the limited government part of our two-prong concept, they love that statement. But what most Americans forget is that our government is also very powerful. How powerful? Well, let's look at the legislative branch. The primary role of Congress is to make the laws of the nation, or as Yoda says, write bills to become laws. The legislative branch must. In this process of writing bills, we call this codification. Without Congress, there are no laws on which we will run our nation. Well, what can Congress do in making these laws? A lot. The legislature addresses these issues when making the laws. They approve the annual budget, how much money we will spend each year to run our federal government, and spending bills, the bills that state what we're going to pay, originate in the House. They raise revenue through taxes and other levies pursuant to the Tax and Spending Clause and the 16th Amendment, that's the Income Tax Amendment of the Constitution. But they can only raise money to pay for the nation's debt, provide for the common defense, and promote the general welfare. If they are spending money on those 3 things, they can spend as much money as they want, and they can ask people for as much money as needed through taxes and levies. Congress also regulates interstate and foreign trade pursuant to the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. But only the Senate ratifies treaties that we enter into with other nations based on a 2/3 majority. Regulating trade can mean a lot of things, and Congress uses that Commerce Clause to control a lot of what happens in this country. But as you also see, even inside Congress, we separate the powers between the Senate and the House of Representatives. Congress confirms or denies presidential appointments. This process occurs in the Senate. That's one of the checks that we learned. And Congress formally declares war. Here's the thing. Congress rarely formally declares war and instead passes a resolution authorizing the use of force. You'll learn about resolutions more when we look at Congress in detail. Go to the next slide. You will learn when we look at Congress in detail that Congress is specifically told what it can and cannot do. The same is not entirely true for the president, and because of this, the president and the executive branch is also very powerful. The president executes, enforces, and administers the laws of the United States at his or her discretion. In other words, hello, I'm in charge. It's the President of the United States of America who is in charge of running the federal government. Congress passes bills into law. The President takes what Congress says and runs the country based on those laws. Well, how does the President do that? The executive addresses these issues when executing and enforcing the laws. The president prepares the annual budget for congressional action. The president puts together a gigantic document and says, hey, Congress, this is how much it's going to cost to run the federal government next year. Please pass some spending bills so that we can fund the government. The president also appoints cabinet officers, ambassadors, and federal judges with the advice and consent of the Senate. There's another one of those checks and balances. And finally, the president administers the federal bureaucracy. Those are the departments of the United States government. Bureaucracy! Bureaucracy everywhere! There are many different federal agencies administered by the president. The executive branch is the largest branch in the federal government. Go to the next slide. When we look at the United States Constitution, we have to wonder if our founding fathers kind of like ran out of ideas about what our government was supposed to do. They knew exactly what they wanted Congress to do. They kind of knew what they wanted the executive to do, but when it came to the courts, they had no clue. Because of this, the courts seized a lot of power and are perhaps the most powerful branch of all in the federal government. The Supreme Court exercises the power of judicial review. What is that? The federal courts address these issues when reviewing laws and trying cases. District courts hold trial. Think Judge Judy. It's in the district courts where two groups of people, we call them litigants, plaintiffs or defendants, or the United States versus a criminal defendant, come together and say, we need a place to try this case so that we can figure out who's right and who's wrong. That's what happens here. But remember, we have a limited government, so we can only hear certain cases and controversies. We can only hear cases involving federal law, questions involving interpretations of the Constitution of the United States, disputes between the states themselves, and disputes between citizens of different states based on a monetary threshold. If you can't show that you fall within that very narrow category, you cannot try your case in a federal district court. Then we have the courts of appeal and the Supreme Court, who review the decisions of trial courts to determine the constitutionality of trial court rulings. When judicial review deems a law unconstitutional, thou shalt not pass this line of sand. In other words, if the Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court looks at what a district court decided and says, you can't do that under the United States Constitution, that case either has to go back to the district court for another trial and hearing, or the case dies. That's a lot of power. Go to the next slide. Now you know the true power of the federal government, but the question is, do all citizens have equal power in controlling that government through their vote? The power of your vote is not equal to the power of other voters in the United States. For example, the vote of a citizen for a member of Congress carries different weight based on the population of the voter state, and the vote of a citizen for president carries different weight based on the total state population due to the winner-take-all nature of the Electoral College. What does this look like? Let's compare the power of voting in Wyoming to that in New York. In Wyoming, we have a total population of 500,000 people who are represented by one congressman. There are more congressmen in New York, but 750,000 people are represented by one congressman. It gets worse when you look at the Senate. Voting for a senator in Wyoming, that senator represents 500,000 Wyoming citizens. Voting for a senator in New York, that senator represents 20 million citizens. So, to equal the power of one Wyoming vote, you need the power of 1.5 New York votes. Or in other words, somebody's vote in Wyoming carries more weight than that same vote in New York. And then we have this. The courts are the only unelected branch of the United States government. In other words, you have no direct impact into who will serve on the federal bench, the most powerful branch in the federal government, and we do not vote for these people. So things like this happen where more than one president has learned about the power of the court. In other words, our elected leader often runs into trouble when he has to deal with an unelected Supreme Court. That's it for this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you in class.